They tried to force me to marry for money, but my shocking rejection changed everything. You know that feeling when you realize you're about to make the biggest decision of your life, and it's not just your future on the line, but your freedom. I didn't think I'd ever be in a situation like this. The kind where people, your family, no less, try to force you into a marriage you don't want, just for money. But that's exactly what happened to me. And when I turned it down, the consequences were insane. What happened next left me questioning everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and family. Part 1. The pressure was real. So, let me set the stage for you. I grew up in a fairly traditional family. My parents, especially my mom, had always been very old-fashioned. The idea of marriage wasn't just about love. It was about stability, security, and, unfortunately, money. It wasn't uncommon for my mom to talk about marrying well whenever we'd have conversations about my future. She'd drop hints like, "You know, dear, it's so important to marry someone who can take care of you," or, "Have you met anyone with a good job?" At the time, I thought it was just typical mom talk, but then things started to shift. It wasn't just her anymore. My entire family, even extended relatives, started asking about my dating life. Now, I'm not some wild, rebellious type, but I had always been a little independent. I didn't rush into relationships, and I wasn't interested in people who weren't genuinely compatible with me. That's when my uncle, a successful businessman with a lot of influence, started getting more involved in my life. He'd invite me over for lunch and casually mention, "You know, your cousin just got married to a guy with a really promising startup. It's great that they're set up for life now." He'd say things like that, but I could tell there was an underlying message. Do you have a plan for your future? At first, I didn't catch on. I thought it was just the usual family advice, but the more they brought it up, the more I realized something wasn't right. A couple of months later, I met someone. Let's call him Josh. He seemed like a good guy at first. Sweet, down to earth, a little quirky, but definitely not someone I could see myself marrying. Still, he had a solid job in finance, and his family was well off. I thought, okay, maybe my parents would like him. The first time I introduced him to my mom, her face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. She gave me this look, like I had finally done it, found someone who could take care of me. But here's the thing. It felt wrong. I didn't like him in that way, and that was the first time I realized my family wasn't just hoping for me to settle down. They were pressuring me to settle down with someone who fit a specific mold. And Josh, he was the perfect candidate. I started noticing the comments getting more direct. My mom would casually ask, "So, when do we get to meet Josh's parents?" And my uncle? He started talking more seriously about my future prospects, as if the only thing that mattered was what I could gain financially from a marriage. It was all about securing a future, not about love. But things took a darker turn when I realized that they weren't just talking about my future prospects in vague terms anymore. They had a very clear plan for me. Part 2. The offer they couldn't hide. I wasn't completely blind to the subtle pressure my family had been putting on me. It was one thing to nudge me in the direction of a guy like Josh, but it was another when they started talking in more concrete terms. One evening, I was invited to my aunt's house for dinner. I thought it was just a regular family gathering, but when I walked in, I noticed the vibe was off. Everyone was there. My parents, my uncle, my aunt, even some of the older cousins. And they were all smiling in that way that made me instantly suspicious. After a few rounds of small talk, my uncle leaned in and said, "We've been thinking, and we've got a great idea for your future." I knew exactly where this was going. It was that tone, that carefully measured delivery that made me freeze. Then my mom chimes in, "You know, dear, Josh is such a good match for you. His family is well established, and his company is growing. I think we'd all be really happy if you two moved forward." Now, I wasn't an idiot. I could tell where this was heading. What they were implying wasn't just a suggestion to date or see where things went. They were practically setting up a business deal, one where my emotional happiness didn't really matter. My uncle added, "You know, with your family's connections and Josh's success, the two of you could really make something of yourselves. It's not just about love, it's about building your future. This could be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for you." I wasn't sure if I should be angry, confused, or just completely disgusted. My entire life, I'd been taught that marriage was supposed to be about partnership, trust, and yes, love. But here they were, practically throwing those values out the window for something that sounded more like a corporate merger than a relationship. I stared at them, trying to process what was happening. It felt like I was trapped in some kind of nightmare. I wanted to scream, "I'm not some pawn in your game." But instead, I just sat there, listening to the way they were talking about me, as if I wasn't even part of the decision-making process. And then it got worse. My aunt, trying to ease the tension, says, "Look, we're not saying you have to rush things, but it's important to start thinking about what's next. You don't want to waste time, and Josh is a perfect opportunity for you." I could feel my stomach twist. I wasn't just being nudged anymore. This was a clear agenda. My family wasn't just encouraging me to marry Josh for financial stability. They were practically insisting on it. And that's when it hit me. They didn't care about me at all. They cared about what Josh and I could bring to the table. That night, I went home feeling more confused and frustrated than ever. How could they do this to me? How could they try to dictate my future based on money? But here's the kicker. It wasn't until the next day that things really escalated. Part 3. The Shocking Ultimatum. The next day, I woke up to a message from my mom. It was one of those text messages that seems innocent at first, but you know something's off the moment you read it. She told me to meet her at a cafe for a quick chat. I thought, all right, maybe she just wants to talk things through. I still wasn't fully convinced that they were pressuring me, even though the dinner the night before was ringing alarms in my head. I walked into the cafe, and my mom was already sitting at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. She looked up when I sat down, her eyes scanning me with that familiar, calculating look. Without wasting any time, she jumped straight to it. "You know, sweetie, we've been having a lot of discussions about you and Josh. Your father and I have been talking to his parents, and we're all in agreement that this is the right move. His family has a lot of resources, and they're willing to invest in your future. But you need to make a decision. We can't keep waiting forever." I stared at her, not sure if I was hearing this correctly. "Wait, what do you mean waiting forever?" I asked, feeling my pulse quicken. She sighed, leaned forward, and said it plainly. "If you don't move forward with this relationship, you'll be on your own. No financial help, no support. Your father and I have been setting aside money for you to help with your future. But if you don't commit to Josh, we're going to stop. This is your chance, and if you pass it up, that's on you." I couldn't believe it. My own mother was basically telling me that if I didn't marry Josh, I would be cut off. My family's love came with strings attached, very expensive strings. My mind was racing, trying to process what was happening. I knew I couldn't go through with this. Not for money, not for anyone, but the pressure was overwhelming. It was like my entire family had decided that this was the only way I could succeed in life. I stared at her for a long time, feeling this intense wave of betrayal. My mom, the person who always told me to follow my heart, was telling me to sacrifice it all for stability. She was trying to make me believe that love wasn't enough, that money and connections were more important than anything else. I don't know what came over me, but in that moment, I made up my mind. I stood up and said, "No, I'm not doing this." My voice shook, but there was a fire in me I didn't even know existed. My mom's face immediately hardened. "You don't understand, do you? This is your future. If you don't take this opportunity, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. It's not just about you anymore. It's about what's best for everyone." I didn't know how to respond. The idea that I would regret not marrying Josh for money, for stability, it just didn't sit right with me. Before I could say anything else, I grabbed my bag and walked out. It felt like the ground had been ripped from under me. I'd just walked away from the only family I'd ever known, the people who had raised me, in a way that felt so final. It was terrifying. But deep down, I knew I'd made the right choice. But I had no idea what was coming next. I had no idea how far they would go to force me into this marriage. Part 4. The Fallout. After that conversation with my mom, things went from tense to downright hostile. The next few days were a blur of angry text messages, phone calls, and passive-aggressive comments from my family. I thought it would calm down, that maybe they'd just need some time to process it. But nope, this was not something they were going to drop. The worst part was the pressure coming from everyone. My mom wouldn't stop calling. She left voice messages with lines like, "You're throwing your future away," or "This is a huge mistake, you'll see." But it wasn't just her. My aunt, who'd been the one to talk up Josh at the dinner, sent me an almost daily barrage of texts, as if I hadn't already made it clear what my decision was. One message read, "This is your life. You have the choice to make it great or make it hard. You'll figure it out, but don't say we didn't warn you." Then there was my uncle. He went from being charming and subtle to outright aggressive. He called me one evening, his tone colder than I had ever heard it before. "You really think you can succeed without Josh? Without his family's help? You're a grown-up now. Time to stop living in a dream world." I tried to hold it together, but honestly, it felt like the walls were closing in on me. I started second-guessing myself, wondering if I was being too stubborn, too idealistic. What if they were right? What if I was throwing away the best chance I would ever get to secure my future? But I couldn't shake this gut feeling that something was off. This wasn't about what was best for me. This was about control. My family wanted me to marry Josh not for me, but for the perks that came with it. And I wasn't having it. I thought I'd be able to handle the fallout, but things took a much darker turn. Josh's behavior started to change too. At first, I thought it was just me reading too much into things. But then I noticed it wasn't just the family putting pressure on me. Josh himself started talking more seriously about our future, in a way that felt off. He'd bring up wedding venues or when we get married, as if it was already a done deal, and when I'd mentioned that I wasn't ready, he'd get agitated. One evening, he told me, "You don't get it, do you? This isn't just about us. Your family's involved, my family's involved. We're already halfway there." And then, after a brief pause, he added, "If you back out now, you're not just disappointing your family, you're making everyone look bad." That was it. I felt like I was trapped in a cage. The pressure was no longer coming just from my family, but from Josh too. I didn't want to disappoint anyone, but at the same time, I didn't want to live my life on their terms. I remember staring at him in disbelief. "I didn't ask for any of this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't care what anyone else thinks. I'm not marrying you for your family's money. I'm not marrying you because anyone else wants me to. This is my life." But Josh didn't look relieved. Instead, he looked annoyed, irritated. He gave me this long, almost pitying look, and then shrugged. "Well, good luck with that," he said, turning to walk away. "I guess we're done then." And just like that, Josh and I were over. Not because we weren't compatible, but because my refusal to play the game, his game, meant that I wasn't worth it anymore. I felt hollow after he walked away, like everything had come crashing down around me. But what really hit me hard was what happened next. My family disowned me. The calls stopped, the messages stopped, and when I tried reaching out, no one responded. I didn't hear from my parents, my aunt, or my uncle. It was as if I had never existed. It was like I'd been erased. For the first time in my life, I realized that my family had never really loved me for who I was. They had loved me for the potential benefits I could provide by marrying into wealth. Part 5. The unexpected turn. So, there I was, cut off, alone, and still reeling from everything that had happened. The weeks after my rejection were the hardest of my life. I had never imagined that the people who were supposed to love and support me would turn their backs so easily. It felt like I had lost everything. My family, a relationship I thought was going somewhere, and my sense of identity. But here's the twist. The more time I spent away from them, the more I realized something I hadn't fully understood before. I didn't need them, not in the way they had made me believe I did. I was capable of carving my own path, even if it meant walking alone for a while. During that time, I took a step back from everything and focused on my career, my friends, and just me, for the first time in years. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't fun, but it was freeing. I started to rebuild my confidence, to remember who I was before the pressure to conform had clouded my judgment. And here's where it gets crazy. A few months after all this drama, I got a job offer. Not just any job, but a really amazing one. It was a huge promotion at a company I'd always admired, and it came with a salary that was more than enough to support myself. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had truly succeeded on my own terms. It wasn't handed to me by some rich family or secured through a marriage. It was mine. And the best part? It had nothing to do with anyone else's expectations. Meanwhile, I started hearing through mutual friends that my family was falling apart. Apparently, my mom and uncle were at odds over their business ventures, and without Josh's family to back them up, they were struggling. My aunt, who had always been the follower, had started to open up about her own regrets. How she had pushed me into a marriage that wasn't even my choice. She even apologized to me, though it didn't fix anything. I won't lie, I felt a tiny bit of satisfaction knowing that the people who had tried to control my life were facing their own issues. But honestly, it wasn't about revenge. It was more like a wake-up call for me. I had chosen a path of independence, and while it was tough, it led me to something better. A few months later, I ran into Josh. I wasn't expecting it. Hell, I wasn't even thinking about him. He was at a conference I was attending for work, and when I saw him in the lobby, my heart didn't race. Instead, I just felt indifferent. He looked at me like he wanted to say something, but then just gave me this half smile and walked away. And honestly, I was relieved, because I realized I didn't need to explain myself to him or anyone else. I finally understood that my worth wasn't tied to what other people thought I should do or who I should marry. Fast forward to today, and I'm doing better than ever. I'm in a relationship now with someone who loves and supports me for me, not for any financial status or social connections. And while I still have some complicated feelings toward my family, I've learned to distance myself from their toxic expectations. I'm not perfect, but I'm finally at peace with the decisions I've made. So, what's the takeaway from all of this? If there's one thing I've learned from my experience, it's that the only person who gets to dictate your future is you. No one, not family, not a partner, not anyone, should ever make you feel like you owe them your happiness, your dreams, or your autonomy in exchange for their approval. It might be tough, it might be lonely at times, but sticking to your values and staying true to yourself will always pay off in the end. So, if you're in a similar situation, or if you're struggling with outside pressure in any part of your life, just remember, you don't have to live for anyone else's expectations. Find the courage to say no to things that don't align with your heart, even if it means disappointing people you love. And here's my question for you. Have you ever been in a situation where someone tried to push you into something you didn't want, just for their own benefit? How did you handle it? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments, and if you've ever had to stand up for yourself in a way that changed your life, drop a like, share the video with someone who needs to hear this, and subscribe for more stories like mine. You're not alone in this. Together, we can create a space where we support each other's choices, no matter how tough they may be.